So I talked Lou Horvath into a way to save a lot of money. From here on out, rather than having Joseph Pearce, Dale Ahlquist, and me present, he's just going to pay me and I'm going to imitate them. I'm Dale Ahlquist of the American Chesterton Society. Get a membership at my table. And then I'll do Joseph Pearce. You won't be able to understand a thing I'm saying, which will be the case for the next 45 minutes. Now he's going to speak on Oscar Wilde. Dale and I have a favorite biography. Joseph Pearce has written 7,418 books. The best one is The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde. It's probably his best. Actually, his biography on Chesterton, I think, is my favorite. But this is a great book, The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde. You'll want to get it. He only has a few left, so when the speech is over, you got to make a mad rush to this table and buy the remaining biographies. Anyway, he's a great man, a good friend, and even though you won't be able to understand him, he's somehow entertaining in spite of it. Joseph Pearce, there he goes. What did you say? It's good to be back. Say 15th annual Rochester Chesterton conference. I've been to all but one, and it's actually one of the highlights of my year, so it's very good to be back. This year I am giving a talk on Oscar Wilde, and I enjoyed writing this book because there are two types of biographies. There's when you're writing the biography of someone who's basically a together person, someone who's holy, you just tell the story of their life. It's pretty unproblematic, so Chesterton would be a case in point. But from a biographer's perspective, you've got someone who's got issues and problems and making all sorts of bad mistakes and living with the consequences of those mistakes and being conflicted in the way they're approaching things. You're sort of wrestling with the subject to try to actually make sense of them and then to convey and communicate that sense. So writing this book was exhilarating and exhausting. So who was Oscar Wilde? Now, actually, a couple of people have even said to me, you know, I'm looking forward to your talk because, of course, I know who Oscar Wilde is, but I don't really know anything about him, and what I do know scares me. Because the point is basically that we only really have caricatures of Wilde. He's either the gay icon, the homosexual icon, the martyr to the cause of homosexuality, or he is a decadent pariah, someone who's beyond the pale because of his lifestyle, and therefore not to be trusted, certainly not to be read, and preferably not to be spoken about. Now, obviously, I'm not in that camp, because camp? Did someone say camp? Obviously, I'm not in that camp, because otherwise I wouldn't be here giving the talk on Oscar Wilde. So what I would like to do is to give the rationale for why I thought a biography of Wilde, which sought to the unmasking of Oscar Wilde, was necessary. So at the beginning of my book, in the preface, I have this to say. I talk about the fact that no adequate study exists. The transcendent reality at the heart of the man remains an untold mystery. The problem stems from an inability to see Wilde except through the lens of either Puritan or prurient motives. The prurient see Wilde as a subversive hero who undermines traditional values. For this school of thought, his value is not primarily in his art, but in his licentious life, encapsulated in the lurid title of Melissa Knox's study of Wilde as Wilde's long and lovely suicide. Against the prurient is counterposed the Puritan, who believes that Wilde's work lacks value because of his immoral life. The most extreme example of the Puritan school of thought was St. John Irving, whose conclusion to his appraisal of Wilde published in 1952, is particularly scathing. So I'm going to read from this. Wilde came into the world with a small talent and made little of it. He did worse than that. He denied his principles by his practice. He cast such pearls as he had before swine, and then wallowed with the swine at the troughs in the sty. He was a flippant man who turned high matters to bibblers' jests, and would not forego a witticism to spare a friend's wound. A brawler in the temple may be sincerely affirming a faith, but a man who titters in the temple and is flippant about his faith is a recusant who denies without any affirmation in the denial. The steward who hid his talent in the napkin was cursed and condemned. But what punishment is fitting for the man who takes his gift from God and drops it in the mire? That was the sin committed by Oscar Wilde, which was the sin against the Holy Ghost. No doubt where Oscar Wilde's ending up as far as St. Irving is concerned. And this is how I conclude about this dichotomy in the way people see Wilde. The prurient and the Puritan are both blinded by their bias. To one, Wilde is a war cry. To the other, he is a warning. One betrays him with a kiss, the other with a curse. It is a choice between Judas and the Pharisee. George Bernard Shaw, in his preface to the 1938 edition of Frank Harris's biography of Wilde, admitted that he had, quote, somewhat pharisaically, unquote, summed up Wilde's last days in Paris as those of, quote, an unprofitable drunkard and swindler, end quote. Yet, he argued, those of Wilde's admirers who had objected to this description of their hero had forgotten, quote, that Wilde's permanent celebrity belongs to literature and only his transient notoriety to the police news, end quote. It is a fact that is forgotten by Wilde's detractors as much as by his admirers. In both cases, he is condoned or condemned in accordance with the personal prejudices of those sitting in judgment. He is presumed innocent or guilty before the evidence is heard. Both sides pontificate before pondering Wilde's own words and come to conclusions before hearing and comprehending the arguments of the case. They are too busy casting stones at Wilde or each other to remember that the subject of their passion was first and foremost an artist who expressed the deepest secrets about himself in his art. We are all in the gutter, says Lord Darlington in Lady Windermere's Fan, but some of us are looking at the stars. To look for Wilde in the gutter, whether to wallow with him in the mire or to point the finger of self-righteous scorn, is to miss the point. Those wishing a deeper understanding of this most enigmatic of men should not look at him in the gutter, but with him at the stars. So what I endeavour to do in this book is to do that, is to try to see Oscar Wilde as he sees himself through his own eyes, and to make sense of him. And when we do that, we don't judge and condemn from the position of the prurient, the Puritan. Wilde's neither a war cry nor a warning. We see him as a human being. We see him as a child of God, and we see him as one who had a lifelong love affair with the Catholic Church. He was an unfaithful lover, but he never lost the love. And when he's received into the Catholic Church on his deathbed, it's a logical and theological consummation of that love affair. So my book, if you like, concentrates on that love affair between Oscar Wilde and the Church. So for instance, if we want to know who Oscar Wilde was, we have to get beyond the masks, beneath the masks. We have to remove the masks. that he sort of consciously placed in front of him. And one way of doing that is to look at the one work he wrote that he never thought would be published, with intended for readership of one person. So he's not playing to the gallery. Now, Wilde said once, well, someone said to Oscar Wilde once, "Is it true, Oscar, that you walked down the Strand with a lily in your hand?" And Wilde said, "To have done it was nothing, but to make people think you had done it was everything." So in other words, he builds up a persona about himself that takes on its own life, so that people are actually telling stories about things that he did or said that he never did or said. And as he would discover, that's very dangerous. But this one book, where this one work, where he pours himself out in candour and honesty to an audience of one, is the letter he writes to Lord Alfred Douglas, who's the young man with whom he has the disastrous affair that leads to his imprisonment. And he writes this in prison. It would be published after his death under the title De Profundis, from out of the depths, from one of the penitential psalms. So it's worth looking at this because it's the most honest of his writings. There's no masks. It's the most private. He's writing it in prison. It's also the most broken. And as Wilde says in the Ballad of Reading Gaol, how else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in. And there are no masks. And the work is basically a defense of Catholicism, a defense of a Catholic understanding of life and art, and an act of penance on his part for being led astray into the homosexual lifestyle and the life of lust. And when I was doing my research for the book, I went to the British Library, and the actual manuscript, the original manuscript that Wilde wrote, is in the British Library. And you get it, and when you look at it, it's very interesting, because when he's writing about the church and Christianity and the beauty of Renaissance art, or Dante, he read the whole of Dante's Divine Comedy in prison in the original Italian. When you look at it, the writing is all very neat, tidy, and he's obviously, at peace. And then he thinks about his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, and immediately the writing gets wild, large. He's obviously angry, and so this rather oscillation between these calm reflections and this anger at himself and Lord Alfred Douglas and at their life together. Now, what's interesting about that book is when it was first published, shortly after Wilde's death, all the angry references to Lord Alfred Douglas are removed, and all the pious stuff is in there. So you have this work of almost saccharine piety by Oscar Wilde. And then on the centenary of Wilde's death, 2000, I took part in a festival in a theatre in London. I gave a talk. But part of that festival had Corin Redgrave. I don't know if any of you have heard of the actor Corin Redgrave, brother of Vanessa Redgrave. He's a good actor, but he did a one-man show as Oscar Wilde doing De Profundis. And he did the complete opposite. Left out all of the Christian references, all of the Catholicism, all of the pieces about medieval art. It's just about his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, and acted in such a way as it's whilst being self-righteous. So again, we see this whole thing about the Puritan and the prurient. In De Profundis, Oscar Wilde refers to his homosexuality as his pathology, as his sickness. And that in itself should put an end to all those who try to make him a gay icon. In actual fact, what he says there would get him sent to prison in many countries in Europe for his homophobia, not his homosexuality. Indeed, not all that far from here, just cross the border. And if you said that sort of thing north of the border, you would also find yourself in trouble with the law. And in California, it's illegal to actually advertise or advocate or practice any psychological counselling to people for their homosexuality, because it's illegal in California to consider it a pathology. So Oscar Wilde is certainly out of step with the spirit of the 21st century in the way that he looks upon his own life and the mistakes he made. And of course, the people that do hold Wilde up as this icon, this sexual revolutionary, this liberator, are irked by the fact that Oscar Wilde was received into the Catholic Church on his deathbed. And what I show in my book is this was actually, far from being an enigma or a contradiction, is actually the conclusion of his life in both senses of the word. The end, but also coming to the answers. And you find that people that want to hold Wilde up as a sexual liberator are in denial about his Catholicism. They say it didn't happen. So another important thing in the book, of course, is to look at the evidence. There are only two people present with Wilde in Paris when he died. His friend Robert Ross, Canadian, who is, as a young man, is the person that's generally considered to be the person that introduced Wilde to homosexual practices while Wilde's wife was asleep upstairs with their two sons. Robert Ross subsequently becomes a Catholic, a convert, and Robert Ross is the only one of Wilde's friends who hasn't deserted him, who's actually still there. So the first shall be last, the last shall be first, if you like. And Robert Ross asked Oscar Wilde if he would like him to get a priest. And Wilde nods in his assent. The priest is God, Father Cuthbert Dunn, who Wilde didn't know, who Robert Ross didn't know. And the last rites administered with Wilde's full assent. He died soon afterwards. Robert Ross and Father Dunn never see each other again after that. Separately, about 20 years apart, they write their own memories of that night, and the two stories corroborate precisely. So the evidence is overwhelming. It's as solid as anything can possibly be. All right, so this was the end of his life, and I actually spoke once at a courage conference. I've spoken a couple of times at courage conferences. Courage, I don't know what courage is. It's a charitable movement within the Catholic Church for those struggling with same-sex attraction. And I gave a talk on Oscar Wilde, and there was this woman stood up in the Q&A and was outraged that Wilde should have been received into the Catholic Church on his deathbed, because that means he goes to heaven. How dare someone with that sort of lifestyle and then sort of creep in at the back door, so to speak, the very last moment. Well, I'm glad that you had that reaction. It's not a Pharisaical reaction, but that's one of the glorious things about Catholic teaching, Catholic doctrine, is the doctrine of purgatory. It's not that someone is going to be assumed into heaven like the Blessed Virgin. He's going to have to pay for his sins. He is going to get to heaven, but only when justice is done as well as mercy. And one modern mistake is to think that justice and mercy somehow are opposed to each other. God is both, and God's not schizophrenic. All right. So let's take the whole story back. So was it just an aberration? Maybe was Wilde just mad? Did it go off his head in his final sickness? Was acting irrationally? Well, let's look at his life story. Oscar Wilde comes close to conversion as a young man, as an undergraduate at Trinity College in Dublin. He starts attending Mass. He has friends who are priests. And his father is horrified at the fact he seems to be on the brink of poping, on the brink of becoming a Catholic. So to save him from the clutches of the priests, he ships him off to Oxford. Now, if you know anything about Oxford in the 1870s, he was really taking Wilde out of the frying pan and putting him into the fire. Because the Oxford movement was the beginning of the Catholic revival, the conversion of John Henry Newman in 1845. Because Newman, Oxford was his stamping ground. The Oxford movement is there. Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was quoted the great effect, was received into the Catholic Church in 1866 by Newman while he was an undergraduate at Oxford. So Wilde comes to Oxford, and again, very quickly attending Mass, getting in all-night arguments with friends about theology, and he is basically a Catholic. In all of the sides he takes, many of his friends are converting. He sides with Cardinal Manning and has a picture of Cardinal Manning in his rooms at Oxford, and also of Pope Pius IX, Pio Nono. Now that's significant itself, not just for being Catholic, but being a certain sort of mad trad Catholic, so to speak. Because there was a division in the church, not a schism, and it was reconciled between the so-called liberals. Blessed John Henry Newman was on that side, who were the inopportunists, they were called. They were opposed to the promulgation of the doctrine of the infallibility of the Pope. Not because they disagreed with the doctrine, but they thought it was an inopportune moment to actually promulgate it. So these were the inopportunists, the liberals, to use provocative rhetorical terminology. Pope Pius IX was the hardline traditional conservative Catholic, and Cardinal Manning was the cardinal between Newman and Manning. Manning was the hardline. The other word was ultramontane. Was the other word, those that are going to support the Pope. So, whilst choosing to have pictures of Cardinal Manning and Pope Pius IX on his wall, it signifies not merely that he's a Catholic, but he's actually become a somewhat hardline rad trad, to use modern terminology. The other thing about Wilde is at Oxford is there are the two great medievalist lecturers there at the time, John Ruskin and Walter Pater. Wilde attended lectures from both, and it's very significant as to whose side he takes in this. Because John Ruskin is basically, his position is that the Renaissance, the early Renaissance was Catholic and good and solid, and then it became corrupt. And by the late Renaissance, it had become neo-pagan. I think it was Ruskin who said that of Venice, that Venice had fallen from being a medieval virgin to being a Renaissance Venus. Now, Walter Pater agreed with that, except his position was it was a good thing, that the decadence was a good thing, that it was liberated the Renaissance from the confines and constraints of Catholic teaching. It was a healthy decadence. And Wilde was fascinated by Pater's ideas and used them as an artist, as a novelist, in some of his characters and some of his epigrams. But his sympathies were entirely with Ruskin, with the, should we say, Catholic traditionalist understanding of art history. And then in 1878, he's on the brink of converting again. He makes an appointment to see Father Sebastian Bowden at the Brompton Oratory in London. And they have a very long chat, and there's a wonderful letter I quote in the book from Father Bowden, which really lays or does what I'm hoping to do in my book, removes all of Wilde's masks, points the finger directly at the man and not the masks, and tells him what needs to be done. And invites him to come back for another appointment. Oscar Wilde, instead of arriving for that second appointment, sends Father Bowden a bunch of flowers with an apology. Because one of the tragedies of Wilde's life is his weakness. And he ultimately did not become a Catholic as a young man because his father threatened to disinherit him. So instead of having a life of relative luxury, because his father was very wealthy, he would have a life of penury, of poverty. And to be fair to Wilde, that's a real temptation, all right? Take the path of least resistance. And when Wilde got out of prison, he said, if I had ignored my father and become a Catholic as a young man, then all of the mistakes he made in his daily life would probably never have happened if he'd become a Catholic as a young man. But he made the fatal decision to take the path of least resistance, and it led to a hell in his own life. Very briefly, Wilde's first love was a beautiful Irish lady called Florence Balcombe. And I don't think Wilde's a great poet. But I think some of his finest poetry is actually these early love poems he writes to Florence Balcombe. They're very beautiful. Now, she jilts him. He's heartbroken. She actually marries Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. And Florence Balcombe actually becomes a Catholic, is received into the church. But then Wilde's next love is Constance, the woman he will marry and have 2 sons by. And Constance, I see in some ways the real heroine. I think Chesterton says of William Cobbett's wife that she was the powerful silence in his life. We can say the same of Francis as regards Chesterton. We can say the same of Constance as regards Wilde, but Wilde was a much worse husband than either Cobbett or Chesterton were. So she went through all of this, and the judgment she had was that Wilde is he's weak, not wicked. But there's something a bit perverse about Wilde that's going to get him into big trouble. So, for instance, when he and Constance go on their honeymoon, they go to Paris. While there, Wilde buys a new novel, a novel called Arabeur by a French novelist called Joris Cole Huysmans. And this is the decadent masterpiece, the decadent bedside book. Arabeur means against nature, or against the grain sometimes it's translated. And basically the protagonist in that novel is so stinking rich, he can indulge every single one of his passions, every sensual indulgence. And the whole of the novel is basically a catalogue of these sensual indulgences. But they get more and more perverse because, of course, lust is addictive. It's a drug. And you've got to take harder and harder forms of the drug to get the kick. So this book gets more and more perverse. And in the end, he actually wants to experience pain, because that's the only way he's going to get his kick. And the novel ends with the protagonist in a cri de coeur, in a cry from the heart to a God that doesn't even know is there for help. Now, Wilde buys this book and reads it on his honeymoon in the hotel room. Now, I just think there should be better things to be doing on one's honeymoon. Why would one want to be a voyeur in the decadent pleasures of a fictional hero when you can actually have a honeymoon with your wife. Just call me strange. So Wilde basically brings this decadent philosophy back to England. And whereas Charles Baudelaire is the father of the French decadence, Wilde is the father of the English decadence. But we have to understand about the decadence is that these decadents, through a life of decadence, recoiled in horror from the very lifestyles they're living into the arms of Holy Mother Church. Because they are dancing with the devil. And when you start dancing with the devil, the first thing you realize is that the devil is real. And you need to escape while you can. So Charles Baudelaire is received into the Catholic Church on his deathbed. A critic says of Baudelaire's book of poems, Les Fleurs de Mal, the evil flowers or the sick flowers, that after that book, the only choice left to Baudelaire was either the end of the muzzle of a gun or the foot of the cross. Suicide or repentance. Baudelaire was received into the church shortly before his death. Paul Verlaine, French decadent poet, deserted his wife for a homosexual lover. And when the homosexual lover deserted him for another homosexual lover, he shot his homosexual lover and was sent to prison. While he was in prison, he had a conversion experience, was received into the Catholic Church, and when he came out of prison, he published a volume of poetry called Sagesse, Wisdom. Joris Cole Huysmans, this novelist that Wilde read on his honeymoon, writes a trilogy of novels after Avabur, which is the protagonist's descent. First one's called Là-bas, Down There. Descent into the satanic depths of the Parisian underworld, the demi-monde. And there's a horrific depiction of the Black Mass, which shocked me when I read it, and that was before my conversion. I actually read it again as a Catholic, and I was even more shocked. And then Down There, and then the next one's called En Route, so if you like, so it's a bit like the Divine Comedy, it's the descent into hell. The second one is the Purgatory, En Route, on the way, and the final one is La Cathédrale, the cathedral, basically his reception into the church. And Huysmans spends the last years of his life at a monastery. So there's a pattern here with the decadence. And the same thing is repeated in England. So before Wilde's deathbed conversion, many of the other English decadents become Catholic. So Aubrey Beardsley, the decadent artist, is received into the church. He requests that all of his paintings are destroyed. Shortly before he dies, as a young man of tuberculosis. Needless to say, the person who promised to do that didn't. And then Ernest Dowson, the decadent poet, received into the church. Lionel Johnson, another decadent poet, received into the church. Even Lord Alfred Douglas, the young man with whom Wilde had the relationship that led to Wilde going to prison, ends up as a Catholic. Now, there might be a tendency for us to scoff. Well, great, right? So we've got a really high caliber of converts here, haven't we? We get the best, and only the best. La crème de la crème. Well, as Oscar Wilde said, he said the Catholic Church is for saints and sinners. The Anglicans will do for everybody else. I don't want to go on too long here. I'll see if I maybe leave some things out. Obviously, could talk forever. Just go and buy the book, and I could just shut up now. Another 5 or 10 minutes. So, for instance, Wilde's decadent novel, I can say something about his plays and his fairy stories. Obviously, in the book I do. His play Salome, for instance, is again a decadent masterpiece. And Salome repents in the play, and the final symbolism is she's basically bathed in a light of merciful forgiveness because of her repentance for her sin. And the picture of Dorian Gray is a marvellous novel. It's profoundly Catholic, very dark, not to be read to children. And in it I would say the three main characters are all manifestations of Oscar Wilde himself. Hilaire Belloc wrote a wonderful book called The Four Men, and the four men walk across Sussex, and it's myself, the narrator, the poet, the sailor, and the Grizzlebeard, yes. And these are all aspects of Hilaire Belloc himself. And so I'm saying, read the picture of Dorian Gray the same way, that Basil Hallward is the artist, Lord Henry Wotton is the critic, and Dorian Gray is the consequence of the battle between the two, art as idolatry and the critic as cynic. And so all of these aspects in it, and Wilde says as much, that he's in the novel himself, it's almost autobiographical. But at the end of it, the moral is inescapable. Because the picture, it begins basically with Dorian Gray making a prayer or a pact to God or the devil. It could be a pact with the devil that God takes as a prayer which is answered. He gets what he wants, and the picture remains young. So the picture gets old and he remains young. But what the picture shows is all of his sins. So the portrait gets uglier and uglier, and the look in the eye gets wicked, and there's blood on the hands. But he stays young. And he has pangs of conscience. But in the end, he says, all I have to do is destroy the painting. If I destroy the painting, I can live forever and do what I like. And when he stabs the painting, they hear a scream, and they find an old man dead on the floor and a beautiful painting of a young man. The portrait is Dorian Gray's conscience. It was a mirror of his soul, showing him himself. It was meant to call him to repentance. When he makes the final choice to not repent, but to try to kill his conscience. You kill your conscience, you kill yourself, you kill your soul. So when Wilde goes to prison, he spends 2 years in prison. It turns out to not be the hell, but the purgatory. As I said, Wilde read, as well as writing De Profundis, he read the whole of Dante's Divine Comedy in the Italian. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he spent 7 years in forced labour as a dissident in the Soviet prison system, said, thank God for prison. Because he had to go to prison to stop living the lie. Solzhenitsyn's case, Marxist ideology. He'd become an atheist because he was brainwashed by the Soviet regime and its education system. And he needed to be woken up. And the only way that could happen was 7 years in prison. And he thanked God for it. Thank God for prison. Oscar Wilde says something very similar. He writes a poem when he gets out of prison called The Ballad of Reading Gaol. And he says, and this actually plays very much into the general theme here with the talk on Job, especially. But God's eternal laws are kind and break the heart of stone. For how else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in. Thank you.